What would you do if your mother-in-law looked you in the eye and claimed your grandmother's engagement ring was hers? She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She just reached out with those perfectly manicured fingers, slid the ring from my dresser, and said calmly that it had always belonged to her. I remember standing there frozen. The walls felt too still, her voice too soft, and Thomas, my husband, said nothing at all. It wasn't just a ring. It was the last thing my grandmother gave me before she died. The only piece of my history that hadn't already been burned, buried, or boxed away. Judith didn't steal it in the dead of night. She did it in daylight, in silence, like she was rearranging furniture. But what she didn't know was that I had already started recording, and I wasn't going to ask for it back. I was going to make her give it up. Before the lie, I lived quietly. I loved my work. I restored old buildings for living libraries, farmhouses, anything with history in its bones. There was something comforting about peeling back paint and finding the life hidden underneath. I always believed that if you looked closely enough, even the forgotten things had meaning. My grandmother raised me after my parents died. She was the kind of woman who never apologized for her presence. She taught me to sew, to read maps, to trust my own silence. When she passed, she left me two things, a stack of journals and a sapphire engagement ring in a velvet box. The note inside said, "For the woman you choose to become." I carried that sentence with me long after the funeral. It shaped how I loved, how I worked, and eventually how I chose Thomas. Thomas was gentle, measured, dependable. I loved him for the quiet way he cared, the steadiness in his eyes, but he had grown up in Judith's world, not mine. Judith Langford lived for control. Everything in her house had a label. Everything in her life was rehearsed. She wore pearl earrings even to yoga class. When she hugged me, I could feel the distance in her fingertips. She said my name like it was a borrowed word. Still, I tried. I let her host our engagement dinner. I wore the dress she picked out for the bridal portraits. I laughed when she made her quiet jokes about my background, about my unpolished roots. I thought if I stayed gracious, if I just let her shape the edges, she'd learn to trust me. But Judith didn't want a daughter-in-law, she wanted a mirror, and I didn't reflect what she wanted to see. The ring only made it worse. When Thomas proposed with it, I could see Judith's expression shift just for a second. Her smile tightened, her eyes lingered too long. She asked where it had come from, even though I had told her twice. She touched it during dinner. Once, I caught her looking at it while I wasn't wearing it, just resting in its case on my nightstand. I should have known. The way she smiled when she asked questions that didn't need answers. The way she looked at family history like it was her private property. But love makes you hopeful, and hopeful people tend to wait too long before they realize they've been erased. The morning it disappeared, I noticed right away. The velvet box was still there, sitting exactly where I had left it in the top drawer of my nightstand. But it was empty. I remember holding it open, staring into the indent where the ring used to rest. My first instinct was to think I had misplaced it. Maybe I had worn it the day before and forgotten. Maybe it had slipped off somewhere, but that didn't feel right. I'm not careless with things that matter. I asked Thomas if he had moved it. He looked up from his phone and said no, maybe I had left it in the bathroom. That's how it always started with him, soft deflection, harmless confusion. But I could already feel the shift. Something wasn't right. Later that afternoon, I found Judith in the sitting room, sipping her tea, flipping through a garden magazine. The ring was on her hand. She didn't hide it. She didn't apologize. When I asked her why she was wearing it, she looked up calmly and said, "This ring was originally part of the Langford estate. I'm just keeping it safe." I stared at her, unable to speak. She went on. Said Thomas must have been mistaken when he thought it came from my grandmother. Said it looked exactly like one her late husband had gifted her decades ago. Even claimed she had found it in an old box in the attic. I didn't say a word. Not then. Not while Thomas came into the room and stood beside her, his eyes flicking from my face to hers, saying nothing. He didn't defend me. He didn't question her. He just stood there, watching as if all of this could somehow make sense. As if my memory, my grandmother's handwriting. The entire meaning behind that ring could be rewritten by a woman who had never believed I belonged. That was the moment it all fractured. It wasn't about the ring anymore. It was about the ease with which she had taken something sacred and made it hers. About how quickly the people around her accepted that version of the truth. That maybe I had misunderstood, that maybe I was being too sensitive, too emotional. Gaslighting is quiet. It doesn't scream. It simply rearranges the truth until you start to question your own voice. That night, I sat in my car in the driveway and wrote down everything I could remember about the ring. The day I got it, the way it felt in my hand, my grandmother's voice when she gave it to me. I wrote it all down, as if anchoring it to paper would keep it from being taken too. That was the night I stopped crying. That was the night I started watching. I didn't argue, I didn't scream. I let her wear the ring like it belonged to her, like she hadn't carved it out of the last piece of family I had left. But inside, I was already collecting pieces. I started small. I went back through old emails, texts, photos. I found the picture Thomas took the day he proposed, kneeling on the rocky path near my grandmother's rose garden, the ring sparkling in the sunlight. I printed that photo and tucked it away in a folder marked with nothing but the date. Then I called Marla. We hadn't spoken since she moved to Boston to take a position with a firm that handled estate litigation, but when I told her what happened, she didn't ask if I was sure. She just said, "Tell me everything." We met the next weekend at a quiet coffee shop halfway between our cities. She brought a legal pad and a worn leather satchel full of state code books. I brought the velvet box. She examined the interior carefully, tracing the stitching with her finger. Then she looked at the engraved initials inside the lid. "These match the old Whitmore catalog," she said. "You can't fake that without serious money." That was the first time I felt the edge of possibility, like maybe I wasn't alone in this. Together, we began documenting. Marla drafted a statement of provenance based on my grandmother's estate records. I dug through storage and found the handwritten note my grandmother had left with the ring, folded into one of her old recipe books. It was faded, barely legible, but her signature was still clear. While Marla filed quiet inquiries with the local court about the Langford family trust, I handled the house. Judith had a habit of talking to herself when she was alone. A low murmur in the late afternoons when she thought no one was listening. I bought an antique clock from a flea market and modified it with a concealed motion-activated camera, placed it on the mantle in the drawing room where she spent most of her time. And then I waited. Judith didn't disappoint. Within 2 days, she was hosting friends, showing off the ring, laughing about how easily she had reclaimed it. She said I had imagined the whole thing, that I was sentimental and confused. She called me harmless. That word stuck with me. What Judith never understood was that I didn't need to outmatch her in confrontation. I just needed to be patient, to gather every lie, every false memory, every twisted word, and hold them like a rope slowly tightening in my hand. I didn't need to scream to be dangerous. All I needed was proof. Judith's annual Langford Foundation Gala was approaching. She called it a celebration of legacy. I called it something else, her performance. Every year, she invited over 100 people, benefactors, former debutantes, trust lawyers, aging socialites with old money, and sharper tongues. She dressed in silver and stood beneath the chandeliers as if the house itself bowed to her presence. This year, she planned to unveil a new display of Langford family heirlooms. I didn't RSVP, not at first. I waited until the day before to reply, knowing she would see my name last on the list. I wanted her just slightly off balance. I wanted her eyes to skim my name and feel nothing at all. What she didn't know was that the petition had already been filed. Marla had submitted everything: photographic evidence, video files, notarized statements, the handwritten letter from my grandmother. The case wasn't just about theft, it was about fraudulent historical claims. The Langford estate held a protected status, which meant that any antique older than 100 years could not be misrepresented or removed without proper documentation. We had the paper trail, we had the footage, and soon we would have an audience. I wore a black dress, simple, clean lines, no jewelry, let her sparkle. Marla arrived early, dressed in navy with a legal folder tucked beneath her arm. She wasn't there as a guest, she came in as a legal representative of the Whitmore estate, a quiet presence, a sword still sheathed. Judith greeted me like nothing had happened, kissed the air beside my cheek, and complimented my understated taste. The ring was on her hand, flashing in the lights. She stood under portraits of people she barely remembered, telling stories she'd rewritten in her own voice. At the height of the evening, Judith called for attention. She raised her glass and gestured to the display table behind her, where she had arranged several Langford artifacts, the ring among them, nested in a glass case. I stepped forward and asked her gently, carefully, if she would mind telling the room the story of that ring, how it came into her possession, who it originally belonged to. Judith smiled. She launched into her tale. Her voice was warm, rich with crafted nostalgia. She said her late husband had gifted it to her during a summer in Capri, that it had gone missing after his death but had found its way back home. She said it was a sign, a full circle moment. The room nodded with quiet admiration. That was when Marla stepped beside me. She handed the technician a flash drive, and the screen behind Judith flickered to life. The video began without warning. No music, no preface, just Judith's voice filling the ballroom, louder than she ever intended it to be. At first, people assumed it was a tribute, a fond memory, maybe. Her face appeared on screen, sitting in the very room we stood in now, alone, holding the ring between two fingers and laughing softly. She was speaking to a friend on speakerphone. The footage was clear, the timestamp visible. She said, "Helen is still asking about that ring. Poor thing, she really believes it's hers." A pause. Then laughter. "It was never about the ring, it's about reminding her who's in charge. If she wants to play legacy, let her start with nothing." The room went still. She continued, voice sharp with confidence. "You know what they say, history belongs to the one who tells it best. And this family's history, that's mine to narrate." There was no background noise, no distortion, just her words looping into silence. Judith turned to face the screen, her smile frozen in place. For a long moment, she said nothing. The ring on her hand, suddenly loud in its symbolism, caught the light as she folded her arms. I stood still, eyes on her. The weight of the room shifted. It was no longer hers. Someone whispered near the back. Someone else gasped. A champagne flute tipped against a table. She cleared her throat, tried to laugh. Obviously, this is a joke, some sort of manipulation. You all know how AI can be these days. But the technician cut her off. He clicked through the timestamp data logs showing the uncut sequence of camera feeds. The original file metadata, verified by an independent archivist, unedited, authentic. Marla stepped forward and addressed the crowd, her voice even. This ring was left to Helen Whitmore by her grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore. The estate papers, filed and recorded, validate that it predates the Langford marriage by over 40 years. Its theft was not just personal, it was historical fraud. Judith laughed again, thinner this time. "This is absurd. Thomas, tell them. You remember how confused you were when you proposed. I told you that ring looked familiar." Thomas had been silent the entire time, watching, processing. Now he stepped into the light. "I remember everything," he said quietly. "I remember the box, the handwriting, the day I asked Helen. I remember how proud she was to wear something passed down through her family." He looked at Judith. "I remember that you weren't there when I proposed, and I remember that you've been rewriting stories for as long as I've known you." Judith's face shifted. For the first time, her mask cracked not with rage, but disbelief. She had always assumed he would choose her version, that he wouldn't challenge the story she'd written around them. But now he stood beside me. He turned back to the room. "This doesn't belong to her. It never did." Judith didn't speak after that. She just stood there, surrounded by her own silence. The gala ended early that night. People left in clusters, polite but distant, avoiding her gaze as they passed. The applause never came. No one offered to help her pack the display table, not even her staff. and the ring, finally, came home. Judith disappeared from the public eye in less than a week. The Langford Foundation Board convened privately and voted to remove her as chair. The decision was unanimous, no press releases, just her name quietly omitted from the next fundraising gala invitation. Her replacement was announced by email 2 days later, a woman Judith once called decorative but dependable. The heirloom clause within the Langford Trust activated after Marla's petition went through. It froze Judith's access to all antique family property pending a full audit. That meant the ring, yes, but also portraits, china sets, handwritten letters from the late 1800s, things she had always displayed as proof of belonging. Now boxed up and locked in temperature-controlled storage. She filed a counterclaim, claimed the footage was manipulated, that she had been recorded without consent, that the estate documents had been misunderstood, but the case never made it past the initial review. Every detail held, every signature was clean, every lie unraveled. I received the ring from Thomas's hand, not during a grand gesture, just one quiet morning. In our kitchen, with the kettle whistling behind him, he didn't say much. Just opened his palm and waited until I took it back. I held it for a moment, then placed it in its box again. I wasn't ready to wear it yet, not because of what it had been through, but because I wasn't finished understanding what it meant to me now. Thomas and I began therapy. It was his idea. He said he wanted to learn how to speak truth without waiting for someone to do it first. I listened. I asked questions. For the first time, he didn't shrink from them. Judith stayed 2 towns over in a smaller house with fewer mirrors. She still hosted luncheons, but they were quieter now. She no longer held the center of any room. The people who once whispered in admiration now avoided her calls. Her name stopped appearing in social pages. Even the Garden Club newsletter left her off the mailing list. She didn't apologize. I never expected her to, but I saw the silence she lived in now, the stillness that follows when an entire identity built on performance loses its stage. In the family photos, her smile looks tighter, like she's still pretending, but there's a hesitation behind her eyes now. The kind you only see in someone who's been caught looking into a mirror and finding nothing staring back. Control was her currency, and now it's gone. A month after the hearing, I went back to my grandmother's house. The cottage had sat empty since she passed, wrapped in vines and quiet memory. I walked through the room slowly, letting the air settle around me. Nothing had changed. Her chair still faced the window. Her gardening gloves hung by the back door, worn through the palms. I brought the ring with me, still in its box, the note she had written folded beneath it. I didn't wear it. I didn't need to. I just wanted it close. In the backyard, beneath the rose arbor she planted when I was 6, I knelt in the dirt and buried the box in the same patch where she used to grow white lilies. Not to hide it, not to discard it, but to let it rest. So much of this fight had been about what the ring represented: lineage, legacy, proof that I belonged. But standing in that garden, with the sun pressing through the trees, I realized something I hadn't been ready to admit before. I never needed a ring to prove who I was. I had always belonged here, in her story, in my own. The earth was soft, the silence honest. I covered the box with soil and pressed my hand flat over it, like sealing a promise back into the ground. Then I stood and waited. The breeze moved through the arbor gently, just like it did when I was a child, lying on a blanket beside her, reading stories aloud while she trimmed the vines. This was not the end, but it was a closing. I don't know when I'll dig the ring back up. Maybe I never will. Maybe someday I'll pass it on, with my own letter folded beneath it, to someone who needs it more than I ever did. For now, I let it sleep. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I still hear Judith's voice, not angry, just confused. That last night, when the footage played and the crowd turned away from her, she had whispered, as if to herself, "That's my engagement ring." And I had watched her with steady eyes and thought, "No, Judith, it never was. It was just on loan from a story you didn't understand." and now it has gone home.